What's going on, guys? Sunrise Sports and MMA here. I want to talk about the UFC payouts this year. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the UFC and what it's paying its fighters, and this is something that's been going on for several years. Obviously, there's arguments that there is no collective bargaining agreement, that UFC fighters are not making the same percentage as the contemporary sports. I don't think that you can put the UFC and the NFL in the same conversation, but the UFC has, according to online searches, is paying anywhere from 18 or 16 to 20% of the revenue to fighters, whereas sports like the NFL pay close to 50%. Now, I decided to just do a quick research on the UFC, crunch some numbers, and I have some interesting numbers for you to share. I used 2025 as the baseline for this research, and the UFC is due to generate anywhere from 1.5 billion or maybe a little under that for the calendar year 2025. We know that the numbers for Q4 will probably not be out till mid-January. And again, they're a public company, so a lot of that information has to come out. Now, if we go by that number, and I'll just keep it clean, I'll use the 20%. If the UFC is paying their fighters 20% of the revenue generated, that's going to be close to 300 million. Now, I'll even include the fight night bonuses, right? The 200K that usually are given out. So let's start first with the UFC to get to that number. I looked at the UFC, and according to their Wikipedia page, they held 42 events, of which that generated 520 fights. So I then took the amount, and I wanted to look at the fighter distribution. Right now, let's look at the tiers. There seems to be three tiers in the UFC. You have the top percentage, which is your probably high-ranked fighters, probably your pound for pound top 15, and the fighters in each of their respective divisions that are in probably the top five. That would be considered the elite fighters, and of course your champions. Then you have the mid tier, right? The guys that have anywhere from 7 to 8 fights, that are more than likely on their second contract, that win more than they lose, and are pretty much staples in their divisions, right? The guys that you would consider in some cases gatekeepers. And then you have your entry level, which is your 12 to show, 12 to win. So most contracts in the UFC for new fighters, especially if they are not coming from a recognized promotion, they're usually going to be making 12,000 for the appearance, and then 12,000 if they win. Now, on top of that, UFC fighters typically get four bonuses each fight. Usually it's fighter of the night, fight of the night, and I think there's the finish of the night, right? So typically 200,000. There have been times where a fighter has taken home two of them, right? If they won fight of the night and then finish or KO of the night. So very interesting to look at. So what I did then was I wanted to know, what is the roster split, right? We have the three tiers. So what percentage of the UFC is the entry level, for example, mid, and then the top percent? We know that the top more than likely is going to be the smallest percentage, but how does the rest of it round out? Well, this is not official. I didn't go into the UFC. It's very hard to figure out who are active fighters, who aren't. According to the UFC website, they have over 3,000 fighters as active or listed active on their website. But I did ask our good friends with ChatGPT to run some numbers, give me what the percentage breakdown would be in roster distribution. And according to the AI engine, apparently we have about 65% of the roster is considered the entry level. And then you have another 25% that's considered the mid level. And then your top percent would be the 10%, right? Again, as I mentioned, your champions, your top top contenders in each of their weight classes. I'm going to go with the top 5 for each weight class. And then, of course, the men's pound for pound top 15, which again will more than likely include not only champions, but top contenders or top fighters. So then I looked at, well, what is the revenue, potential revenue distribution when you take into account that the average entry level fighter makes, let's say the 24,000, because I'm assuming they're winning, so they're going to stay on the roster. And the mid level fighters apparently make anywhere from 300,000 to about 500,000 each. So, and then you have your top, obviously, which would be about anywhere from 500 to a million, plus the pay-per-view points. We'll see how all of that shakes out. And the numbers are very interesting. It turns out that the entry-level fighters are taking anywhere from 10 to 15 million of the 300 million that's in the pot. Your mid-level fighters are probably taking 45 million of that. And then your top fighters are taking anywhere from 240 to 250 million. Well, if these numbers are accurate, which I'm going to just say that this is the best estimate that we can put together, you're saying that your top fighters, so that's probably going to be anywhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 40 fighters for that calendar year, are making 250 million. Now, we know that the UFC and its fighters, a lot of the top tier fighters really don't complain about how much they're making, because that's just what they're making fighting, let alone any of the deals, social media, any of the other ventures that they have going on. And when I did that, when I looked at the numbers and I took the 300 million and I just did the non-research method and divided that 300 million by 520 fights, it gave me an average of 576,000 per fight. So you could say that the median or the average, just the aggregated average per fighter, is a little over 250,000. But we know that's not the case with fighters. But I found it interesting, right? I wanted to share that with you guys, what I was able to find. It's almost as if the pay distribution is not where it should be, right? And I think this is something that is indicative of not just the UFC, but any MMA combat organization. You treat your stars great. They're going to be there. You create that funnel, right? So that there is the desire to climb the ranks. And I do believe that the entry-level fighters should be paid a lot better. But let's just hypothetically think that or assume that the UFC decides to increase this another 10%, 20%, which I don't think is going to happen. But let's say they get to 25 to 30% revenue split. You're still talking peanuts, right? You're still talking, it goes from 12 to show, 12 to win, to maybe 20 to show, 20 to win, right? So it's a lot better, but I think that the UFC is thriving with their existing model. And again, the 20% that I used was the higher end of that estimation, right? It's really more like 16% revenue split. And even then, some fighters have argued that it's a lot less. So let me know what you guys think. Do you think the UFC needs to pay more? And if so, should it be based on the tiers? Like, for example, should the entry-level fighters make more? Should it be a bigger split amongst the mid-level? Or do we not like what the top tier are making? I'm curious on your thoughts. Sunrise Sports MMA, out.